Okay, so this is the last video I promised for this week, and it's a really important one again because many of the things that we talk about in this pulling everything together video are going to be relevant to your thinking for this week's quiz and the analytical writing part in particular. So pay attention. Don't forget to ask me questions in the tutorial if you have them, and make sure that you really feel very comfortable with this before you embark in on the quiz. Having said that, the quizzes, these little assessments, they're low risk opportunities for you to get feedback. Think of them as learning opportunities as opposed to torture, and we'll be fine. So the Australian government has a commitment to make Australia a global leader in responsible and inclusive AI. Well, at least the last government did. It said so. The new government, we haven't had as much about AI at this stage. So a framework for artificial intelligence ethics have been developed. There is a copy of the core principles for that framework on the screen. It's going to be very hard to look at if you are on your phone. Similarly, those of you who are listening to this in a podcast might want to make sure that you have a look at the slides. If you click on the image in the PowerPoint presentation, there is a link that will take you to the actual report. But what's really important is these 8 ethical principles that organisations can apply to achieve better outcomes with AI, to reduce the risk of negative impacts, and to practice the highest standards of ethical business and good governance. The link that this will take you to is kind of interesting because it shows some of the testing that has been done and some of the projects that some of the biggest companies and organisations in Australia have entered into, looking at ways that they can use AI for the greater good, including their profitability. Let's be frank about it. So the 8 principles are as follows. When we're using AI, the system should be designed and applied, firstly, to benefit individuals, society, and the environment. 2, to respect human rights, diversity, and the autonomy of individuals. 3, to be inclusive and accessible and not result in unfair discrimination. To uphold privacy and data protection and to ensure that data is secure. To operate safely and reliably in accordance with their intended purpose. With transparency and responsible disclosure so that people know when AI is significantly impacting them and can find out when they are engaging with an AI system. Next, with avenues for people to challenge the use or the outputs of AI systems that significantly impact them. And then lastly, number 8, with clarity on who is accountable for the impacts of an AI system and enable humans to oversee AI when needed. So these 8 statements capture the Australian AI ethics principles, and some of Australia's largest businesses have trialled these principles and they've found ways to improve their governance processes. But these are principles, they're guidelines, they are not law. They are really just a signalling of the direction that now previous government was thinking about what the ethical processes should be, and even not really even the government, to be perfectly frank. It's CSIRO's Data 61. It's a range of other lobby groups and policy wonks that are effectively advising the government that these are the principles that they should take into account, and these principles can be applied when they're thinking about developing the law. So the EU, as you probably worked out, way ahead of Australia on this kind of thing, and they're significantly further along. Again, there's a QR code with a link on the screen that will help you get to see what the EU has been doing. Now, they've kind of simplified it further, but have these overlapping ideas. So their focus is less on ethical AI as such, but the language is about trustworthy AI. And trustworthy AI, they say, needs to meet these 3 criteria. Firstly, it needs to be lawful, so respecting of all applicable laws and regulation. Secondly, it needs to be ethical, so respecting ethical principles and values. And thirdly, it needs to be robust, both from a technical perspective, but also taking into account the social environment that operates in. So the guidelines then put forward 7 requirements, 7 key requirements that AI systems should meet in order to be trustworthy. So a special, well, they've got a kind of specific assessment list that helps entities that are using AI to verify the application of each of those key requirements. So they look for human agency and oversight, technical robustness and safety, privacy and data governance, transparency, diversity, social and environmental well-being, and accountability mechanisms. So let's think about each of these one by one. Human agency and oversight. So an AI system needs to, according to the EU, empower humans, allow them to make informed decisions, and foster fundamental human rights. At the same time, proper oversight mechanisms need to be ensured, which can achieve through human in the loop or human on the loop and human in command approaches. So essentially, going back to what I was talking about earlier in an earlier lecture for this week, or mini video, none of them are mini, they're all around 20 minutes, aren't they? But when we're thinking about that moral agency question, one of the key approaches to thinking about the moral agency, so thinking about moral responsibility for activity, is about having humans in the loop at some part of the development process or the use process. Next, technical robustness and safety. AI systems need to be resilient, they need to be secure, they need to be safe, and ensuring that there's fallback plans in case something goes wrong. They need to be accurate, reliable, and reproducible. This is the only way to ensure that unintentional harm can be minimized and prevented. Take a look at ChatGTP. When you actually look at the OpenAI website and you look at what it says about its product, it's out loud, not exactly proud, saying it's not reliable. The data and the responses that you get here aren't reliable, that it can have errors, it just completely messes things up from time to time. I was playing with ChatGTP this morning, actually. I asked it to help me write a rule for Outlook that would allow me to basically delete unread junk mail and distribution lists if they'd been left alone for 7 days. So, you know, like every day I get an email from McKinsey or from the ACCC or whatever, and they're useful. And often when I have time, I enjoy reading them, but basically they're very much in the moment, especially the ones from news agencies. So I just want to move them out of my inbox. If I haven't read them within 7 days, I'm probably never going to read them. Well, we went backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards because basically it kept giving me instructions that just didn't make sense, possibly because it's been trained on a data set that is now more than 2 years old, and I'm using a fairly recent version of Outlook and things have changed. But it gave me what looked like a really sensible solution. It apologized profusely for getting it wrong, but then it kept repeating incorrect information. Privacy and data governance. Besides ensuring full respect for privacy and data protection, adequate data governance mechanisms need to be ensured as well. They need to take into account the quality and the integrity of the data and ensure legitimised access to data. And I want to talk a little bit more about that legitimised aspect idea in the next slide, so keep that in the back of your mind. Transparency. So ultimately, the EU have landed on this idea that in order to be trustworthy, then AI needs to be transparent as well. The data systems and the business models need to be transparent. Traceability mechanisms can help in achieving this, and AI systems and their decisions should be explained in a manner that is adapted to the stakeholder concerned. Humans need to be aware that they're interacting with an AI system and must be informed of the system's capabilities and limitations. The video that you have, the little 10-minute explainer from Toby Walsh, I think I called him Toby Williams in an early video, but I couldn't find it. So maybe it was in an outtake. But anyway, maybe I just couldn't find it. I am not AI. This organic intelligence gets confused quite easily. Anyway, Toby Walsh, in that very interesting 10-minute explainer video, talks about this idea that a kind of new rule of AI should be that people should, number one, know when they are dealing with an AI, and number two, they should also know when they are not dealing with an AI, that it should be unethical to pretend to be an AI if you are not. And I think he makes some really interesting points there in particular, and that transparency point about knowing who or what you're dealing with is really important. Diversity, non-discrimination and unfairness. We need to avoid unfair bias, as it could have multiple negative connotations, from the marginalisation of vulnerable groups to the exacerbation of prejudice and discrimination. AI systems should be accessible to all, regardless of any disability, involve relevant stakeholders throughout their entire life cycle. Now, that's not to say that we should prefer human interaction because there are biases in AI interactions. AI learns bias from us, and human beings often carry biases with them unknowingly. That's why they're called unconscious biases. But working as hard as we can to identify where the bias might be, we are realistically have a greater chance of ensuring that the machines are less biased in the shorter term. So societal or social and environmental well-being. Here the EU are saying that AI systems should benefit all human beings, including the future generations. We need to ensure that AI is sustainable and environmentally friendly. Also, we need to take into account the environment, including other living beings, and their social and societal impact should be carefully considered. So thinking about what the impact of tools on the broader environment is one of the key ethical responsibilities that sits in this EU framework. And then lastly, accountability. Accountability mechanisms should be put in place to ensure responsibility and accountability, and design processes are going to play a key role in doing this, especially in critical applications. Adequate and accessible redress needs to be ensured. So we need to have in the overall governance framework an understanding of who is responsible and what they are responsible for, what happens if and when they get it wrong. I just want to make a special call out, and Anthony Wong mentions this in his paper briefly, or in the reading chapter that you've been asked to read briefly, about the particular position in relation to the use of artificial intelligence and Indigenous communities. Many discussions and protocols have focused on knowledge sharing and management between Indigenous people, science, and decision makers that will provide valuable insights for AI frameworks and applications. There are basically three important issues to consider. In particular, that AI based on data collected on and with Indigenous people needs to consider how that data is collected and how it's used so that it complies with cultural protocols. Secondly, information is not intelligence, and the analytical processes by which Indigenous knowledge is categorised, labelled, shared and incorporated into AI learning and feedback needs to be guided by cross-cultural collaborative approaches. And thirdly, AI needs to be open and accountable so that Indigenous people and organisations are clear about how AI learning is generated and why that information is used to inform decisions. I sort of launched straight into what the issues are without actually giving you an example. There's some really, really fascinating work that's being done using AI and big data to collect information about forest and wilderness areas and then try to apply Indigenous wisdom about land care to ensure that burning off happens at the right time, to minimise the likelihoods of flood and to maximise habitat for key animals that live in Australia. So there's really fascinating work that's being done, but taking a computer and trying to basically do the analysis and turn it into ancient wisdom requires a special amount of thinking. So this brings me to the second last slide, and I want to show you, excuse my dog, the infographic on the slide refers to what the European Parliament are basically recommending. So they've released back in December 2022, so not that long ago, an Artificial Intelligence Act, which is a proposal to regulate the use of artificial intelligence to adequately address benefits and risks of the technology at an EU level. The regulation aims to create a safe space for innovation that complies with high levels of protection of public interest, safety, and fundamental rights and freedoms, while at the same time creating conditions for an ecosystem of trust which will foster uptake of AI services and increase and incentivise development and entrepreneurship. It's a risk-based approach. In other words, certain obligations and restrictions will apply on the risk level stemming from the use of the AI. So rather than the AI itself, it's going to look at where is it being used and what are the risks. It's following the recommendations that were made for that from that paper, the Ethics Guidelines for Trustworthy Artificial Intelligence, that I referred to a little bit earlier. The regulation is going to be applicable to all uses of AI affecting EU citizens, no matter where the service provider is based or where the system developed or being run, or within or outside the EU boundaries. So this is very similar to what's happened with the GDPR, and so it may well be that the EU gets in first, and that assuming that there isn't a huge amount of pushback from the industry, that we will see these kind of principles codified in the way that AI is developed, or responsible AI is developed over time. And so as you can see on the slide, and again, apologies to those of you listening at home who will need to pull the slides out, but it's basically saying, well, the higher the risk is, then the more regulation there will be. So where there is minimal risk, there'll be no obligations at all. But there certain things will be just prohibited because the risk level is unacceptable. So social scoring, mass surveillance, manipulation of behaviour that causes harm. So this is reflecting some of that social engineering stuff that we talked about in the previous week. So high risk are things like access to employment, education and public services, safety components for vehicles, law enforcement, that kind of thing. And limited risk sits in with things like impersonation, chatbots, emotion recognition, biometric categorization, and deep fakes. Now, I find that really interesting, following out of Cambridge Analytica, that we can call deep fakes limited risk, but the EU, there's a lot of negotiation to get to that part. Some really interesting ideas there, and I think it's really useful for us to think, well, what would that look like? If you're a business and you're thinking about using AI, is this a regulatory approach that makes sense to you? So ultimately, what we're talking about is a whole new game. I think the definition of insanity once attributed to Einstein, but apparently not, was this idea that you keep doing the same thing over and over again and then expecting to get different results. the way that we do things is fundamentally changing as a consequence of AI and is going to change significantly more. The fundamental underpinning here is this idea that laws that were developed a long time ago with particular ideas in place about how the world worked and who and what should be responsible may no longer be appropriate. Wong finishes his chapter essentially saying the development of an adequate legal framework for autonomous systems cannot be achieved by simply analogizing. I cannot get my emphasis on the right syllable today. By using analogous existing rules that were designed for humans and then applying them directly to machines. We're really interested to hear what you think, and we'll talk quite a lot about these ideas when we meet in the Tute on Wednesday. Looking forward to it. Cheers.